I'm terribly impressed that on such a cold night we have such excellent turnout from the extremes of age of our members. We have it's that lot in the middle that have let us down. We've got wonderful representation from the medical student section and from our retired members section. So, yes. Yeah, I'm reminded that you should not be bringing your drinks into the hall. It's okay. So, Dr. Gemma Ahearne is senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Social Policy and Criminology. She has a first-class Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and a PhD in Criminology. So she's a highly appointed academic. Dr. Ahearne joined our university in September 2019, well timed just before the COVID outbreak, which really put a kibosh on all the in-person teaching. So you've done really well to keep the attention of the students in the meantime. Before that, she held a lectureship in sociology at Liverpool John Moores University and in both criminology and psychology at Leeds Beckett University. In her biography, it says that Dr. Ahearne has been involved with the sex industry since 2002 and then completed a PhD in 2017 on a thematic analysis of the experiences of sex workers in prison. Her teaching and research interests centre around the regulation of women's sexuality and their bodies, and it covers the different regulatory modes of sex work globally and often invisible influence on the purity culture. Now, one of the members had the cheek to say to me, "How did you meet Gemma?" Which I thought was jolly cheap. And I instantly gave the honest answer: I met her in a pub. And then I had to check myself. It was actually a knowledge exchange event on the Pint of Science, which it was. So that does explain that. But it is she gave a really interesting lecture there, and I made a mental note that if ever I wanted a lecture that was just totally different to the standard chalk and talk of medical lecturers, this was the lady that I would like speaking to her. So it really does give me great pleasure to give Dr. Ahearne the opportunity to speak to the Liverpool Medical Institute tonight. Please, would you give her a very warm welcome?
Thank you so much for coming out on this icy evening, and thank you so much to Callum for inviting me. I was just explaining to Thor that I'm dyslexic, so my main worry tonight is navigating this when it's not my computer, so you might help me in a moment when I do a brief quiz with you to see what you think about the legal framework of sex work in the UK. I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to put you on the spot and then thinking about why that is. So I'm going to be thinking through not just, the law, because I'm a criminologist, so I'm interested in why the law is what it is. It's a political choice to criminalise some things and not criminalise others. That's not a natural thing that is just there, that is produced. And it's produced because of certain discourses that make some people constructed as deviant, and we need to control them and regulate them and so on. So hopefully all of that will become clear in a moment. But it was really interesting speaking to so many people just then over drinks. And I said I'm going to give a few disclaimers before I start properly, which is I don't have a science GCSE. So I am in no way medically qualified, so I'm going to give that disclaimer. And I don't have a science GCSE because of my behaviour around Bunsen burners in the science lab, which I think is, quite offensive, but there we go. But all the conversations we were having just then, if science was taught like that in school, I probably would have been very drawn to it. Because we were talking about all sorts out there, from a research grant I've got recently with Dr. John Tulloch from the veterinary school here, and we're looking at dangerous dogs and dog bites and organised crime gangs, and thinking through criminologically why we've got the dog bite crisis that we do in Merseyside compared to the rest of the UK. It's not just because of the amount of dogs, there's a lot more going on there in terms of demographics, socio-economic deprivation and organised crime gangs. So that's why we've come together. And over that conversation, the gentleman I was speaking to, I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, we were speaking about the new ban on XL bullies. Do I think that's a good thing? No, I don't. I did believe something needed to be done. I was frightened myself walking out with my dogs, but it will just displace and disperse the harm. We're already seeing different dog breeds being used, Malinois and so on, by organised crime groups. They've moved on. The animal welfare charities are now picking up the pieces. These dogs are now being abandoned all over the city, all over the country, which could lead to a lot more bites and a lot more harm. So a lot of what we talk about tonight is going to be about unintended consequences. When we say, this is a bad thing, we don't like it, let's ban it, and that'll get rid of the bad thing we don't like. Will it get rid of it? Or will it just displace it somewhere else? I'm sure most of us, if not all, will think, yeah, the harm's going to move on. But we're going to look at the process that allows that to happen. And other disclaimers, actually, I'll just go on my first slide. Other disclaimers are, although I'm here tonight to talk about sex work and the sex industry, and my talk is entitled Contested Perceptions of Vulnerability, Sex Workers and Stigma, some other disclaimers that I just think it's really important for me to make, particularly given it's being recorded. I'm not promoting prostitution, but I am accepting that some people do sell sex, and therefore I believe that those people should be advocated for, and we should look at harm reduction and the rights of those individuals. It doesn't mean I'm saying everyone should go out and partake in this activity. Likewise, though, just gave me a mini tour before we started of the really interesting plaques out there in the hall, and one of Dr. Ross's clinic for venereal disease, which was brilliant, because I'm going to talk about the socio-historical construction of sex workers as diseased in a moment, and the medical history of that, and also the plaque of the Maryland Centre. And it's really important, I'm sure you all know this anyway, I'm speaking to the converted, but Merseyside has such a rich history of pioneering work in harm reduction. And again, with that work at the Maryland Centre, it's not saying everyone go out and, inject heroin, but if people are going to go out and inject heroin, let's not have them die, because they're a human being. Let's protect them. So a lot of what I talk about today is in terms of harm reduction and thinking about what people need versus what we're told those people need from people who've never sold sex, been involved in the sex industry, may never have lived in poverty, may never have been exposed to these things in a lived experience kind of way. Also, another thing I want to say, I'm not referring to children. So that would be child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation. I'm referring to adults who consensually make that decision to sell sex. And they might have more constraints on them in terms of the decisions that they can make, but they are making that decision, because even when we're talking about adults, if they're not consenting, then that's rape, and that's very clear in the law. Sex workers can give consent, and they can withdraw consent like anyone else. So I just want to get that from the beginning. And also, just as when I teach on this at the University of Liverpool, I like us to see the sex industry as part of the wider continuum of violence against women and girls. And that's not because I'm saying all sex work is violence, but because often sex workers are seen in opposition to the community, and often we'll be told we should get rid of certain venues to protect women and girls. And we're never told what's going to happen to the women that work within the venues. They're seen as disposable. They're seen as, just collateral damage, who cares? So I think it's really important that I put that out there as well. Now I can move on, now I've given you all my disclaimers. So the aims of this talk are to consider the impact of that displacement and dispersal of harms, unintended consequences, and often they're very likely. We can see what those consequences are going to be, but, oftentimes people don't care. I also want to think about our reliance on a carceral approach to solving problems. So, there's a real push to introduce the Nordic Swedish model in English, well, I don't want to give too much away from my quiz bit in a minute. I thought, oh, give me that look then. So, you know, end in demand. And there's that real push, even though it will cause a lot of harm. So yeah, I'm going to give away the quiz if I tell you that bit there. But people often rely on common sense assumptions. They've seen something on the media, it looks good. So when people say, let's introduce this thing, they'll go with it and they won't think about what's actually going to happen on the ground. I also want to think about sex workers, that broader continuum of violence against women and girls. But I also want us to really consider critically the concept of vulnerability. Because often, and I'm guilty of this as well, and my work is in this area, often we use vulnerability as a taken for granted, common sense assumption that we all know what it is and we're all meaning the same thing by that. You know, there's a lot of power when we get to label someone as vulnerable. So who gets to do the labelling and why? Because often, once we label someone as vulnerable, there's then that mechanism of social control. They can't help themselves. We know what's best for them. Even if they're screaming very loudly, that isn't what we want actually, and we've got a global sex worker right movement telling you this isn't what we want, people will still speak over sex workers and for them. And that's why the global slogan of the sex worker right movement, and it is a global movement, it's not just, you know, often people will say, well, you're just talking about white privileged sex workers in the global north. Absolutely I'm not. Some of the biggest grassroots movements of sex workers are in the global south. In South Africa, there's a massive movement, SWEAT, the Sex Worker Education Advocacy Task Force, who are pushing for decrim at the minute in the face of massive brutality, very brave. India as well. On March the 3rd, which is my birthday, so you will not forget, there is International Sex Worker Rights Day, and that was started by between 30 and 40,000 sex workers and their allies in Calcutta, saying we don't want to be brutalised anymore by the police, and we want rights and we want safety. So this is a global movement, and the slogan of that global movement is nothing about us without us. And you'll often hear that used in different harm reduction movements as well, for drugs and alcohol in particular. And my voice always goes, as my students know, I have about 20 tumblers normally, or I get laryngitis, so the medics could maybe help me with that. It's not very good. So we're going to talk about that, you know, what does vulnerability do as a concept, as a label, particularly to sex workers, because it's actually used in a really, a way that makes no sense at all, that we'll talk about in a moment. So I do have this third year module at the University of Liverpool in the School of Law and Social Justice. It's a third year module. The students are expected to get to grips with a whole range of resources and viewpoints, from legal to policy, looking at what charities are doing, looking at what police are doing around the country, and that variety in policing response to sex work. But also looking at lived experience of sex workers. So they write a 3,000 word letter to someone who they want to influence into advocating for decriminalisation, let's say, or advocating for a certain policing model. And I tell them you can't always win people over. It's a very contested topic. It's very emotive, and that is understandable. But you want them to at least begin to meet you where you are. You want them to at least take on board some of the things you're saying and maybe take that conversation up with you again. And that's a skill. It's very hard to negotiate with people, and particularly people who think what you're saying is completely wrong, what you're saying is disgusting. You know, it's very hard to just gently, you might never win them round, but so you can meet at a table and try and think about what different people need. Because a lot of what this is about is conflicting and competing harms and needs. Particularly in a moment when we're going to talk about community tensions as well. How do we meet the needs of everyone? How do we negotiate that? It's very difficult. But students are expected to critically interrogate issues, but this is the important bit. Be able to hold competing and conflicting needs and harms in tension. And they might say at the end of the letter, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but please do consider A, B and C when you're making changes to the law, because it's really important. That's fine. I tell students it's fine to not know all the answers. I'm very suspicious of people that do know all the answers. My thoughts change often, and I've been involved in this now for 21 years. And this is very much a skill the world needs, I think, to be able to do that and not to be drawn into extremes and polar opposites, because you can normally find something somewhere where you do agree. It might just be this person wants sex work to be completely criminalised, they think it's all abuse, they think it's all violence, but they really care for the people doing it and they care about harm reduction. And you might say, I actually want to decriminalise it, but let's meet at that point there and work together for this particular group in our town or our city and so on. So normally, the reason I put this up, normally I get a whole semester to work on this. And tonight I've just got this quick talk. So normally we would have a lot more time to think about these things. This was our biggest module last year. So when I just showed you that slide, and the slides at the beginning, that is a sexual entertainment venue in Liverpool city centre. I'm going to talk a bit more about SEVs in a minute, and one of my favourite topics, the Policing and Crime Act 2009, which I love talking about. And I take the students into this venue. So we map out the city in terms of gendered spaces, gendered harms, and then we go into the club. Obviously, it's not open at the time. We're not voyeurs, we're not creepers. That would be wrong. But I want them to, when I'm talking about the policy and the law, it's very abstract and probably not as exciting for them when I'm talking about the Policing and Crime Act 2009 as it is for me. So I like to show them what we're talking about. And so they can see this as someone's workplace, whether they like it or they disagree with it. That is what people are doing it for as a form of labour. You're all going to have different experiences. Some of you are going to think, yes, I've met many sex workers, perhaps for your medical career, different clinics you've worked in, different surgeries, different projects you've been involved in. You will have done, whether you know you have or not, because sex workers aren't some special secret group of people. They're everywhere. But to think about that and maybe reflect on things that you do think, preconceived ideas, assumptions, and so on. So, I want us to start with a game, because I wanted to liven things up, and this is where I might just have a bit of a breakdown and need Thor's help, because I'm dyslexic and this is not my computer. So, I want you to, if you can, wave your hand around with the QR code. My phone doesn't do this, so we're going to go onto the website once you've all done that, and I can give you a code. So if your phone doesn't like QR codes, mine doesn't, and you want to do this, I can give you a code to input into the website in a minute. But I'm going to let you all wave around first. Yeah. My phone doesn't like this. If not, you can just think and in a minute shout your answer out. That'll be absolutely fine. I didn't even know if we'd have Wi-Fi or people's data would work or anything. So it's good.
Working?
Yeah?
Yeah.
Good. A few people, are you still waving it around? Yeah? I think so.
What we define as sex work is this?
Well, you are a criminologist at Hartley. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. I'm going to leave that open to your interpretation. If you ever want to change from medicine, you can.
I'm not medicine anyway.
Aren't you? There you go. You can come and be a criminologist. Thank you. So I asked you whether sex work was legal in England, Scotland and Wales. Some of you I already spoke about this with out there, so I've kind of spoiled it for you. But I want us to think about whether it's legal or not. So a couple more people are still voting, I think, because it's moving around. Has everyone voted who wishes to vote? Yeah. So 5 of you have said no. 13 of you have said yes. And 2 people who I think are definitely criminologists have said they're not sure. So it's a trick question, really, because certain elements of selling sex are legal, certain elements are not legal. So we actually have a system of semi or partial or quasi criminalisation, where you can sell sex indoors alone or buy it from someone who's selling it alone. That is perfectly legal. But all the surrounding activities are criminalised, they are illegal. So 2 or more sex workers working together constitutes a brothel, even if you haven't got a third party working for you, like security or reception or a maid. Just the fact that there's 2 of you selling sex together from the same premises, that constitutes a brothel in law. Selling sex on street is solicitation or loitering with the purposes of solicitation. Buying sex on the street is curb crawling. Doesn't matter if the person's in a car. Sometimes people think, well, I'm in a car, so that's not curb crawling. Yes, it is, because that car still constitutes a public place. So those activities, also buying sex from someone who has been subjected to coercion or force by a third party, that makes it illegal. Even if you were not aware of that, that was a reintroduction to the Sexual Offences Act 2003 from the later Policing and Crime Act 2009. So I'm glad we've got that one out of the way, and then I'm going to ask you one more question before I leave Thor alone and let him sit down in the warmth. It's very warm in our corner over there. Very warm. So, do you think it should be criminalised? If I'm saying we've got a system of partial, semi, quasi criminalisation, where selling sex indoors is legal, but all surrounding activities are criminalised, do you think it should be criminalised? Some of you will, and it's anonymous, so I'm not going to know. You can, say what you want, really. I'm not going to know. And has everyone done this who wishes to? Yeah, some of you are busy typing away. Yes. Why? If you think it should be criminalised, why?
Is everybody scanned?
This is... Yeah, some of you just like, no. So you don't want to get involved any further. Is anyone else still typing? Yeah? Yes. I'll give it a couple more moments because I think some people are still typing. We've got 18 responses so far. 20. 23. I think everyone has finished now. Yeah. A couple more. So I think the bottom one is interesting for me as a social scientist. It's not as simple as yes or no. And even though I advocate for decriminalisation, I also understand the complexities of different regulatory models. So I'm certainly not saying, that is the right answer and everyone else is wrong. That would be massively arrogant. So it is not as simple as yes or no. You've put no, reduce harm, offence. I don't know whether that person means criminal offence or it could cause offence, public indecency and such. Choice, power, autonomy, other, safeguard, I think that's really important, protection, disease. We're going to talk about disease in a minute because I tried to make at least one slide a bit medical. Freedom, safety, no way Jose, opportunity, no, not. So, yeah, so a range of things. Some people in the room might think, yes, it should be criminalised. You might think it's bad and kind of going back to what we said at the beginning, and therefore we should criminalise it and that'll solve the problem. And it won't solve the problem at all. The current system that we've got of that semi-partial quasi-criminalisation, I've just listed here, that selling sex indoors alone is legal in England, Scotland and Wales. In Ireland it differs. So Northern Ireland were very interested and influenced by the Nordic Swedish model. That idea was often touted as an equality model or a feminist model, and it isn't when you look at the actual outcomes and who is disproportionately criminalised by it. But the idea that you'll criminalise the buyer, you'll criminalise the purchase of sex, and that's somehow going to magically help the seller of sex, when it's not. It's just going to lessen that pool of people, that pool of clients. It's going to make people less likely, less willing to take part in different screening, you know, whether that's online or in person or on the phone, because they're frightened of being arrested, they're frightened of being prosecuted. So sex workers end up with clients they would rather not have, because people, maybe the good clients, the people who they would rather see, are frightened of getting arrested, basically, and everybody knowing what they've been up to. So that was in 2017, and Republic of Ireland, very similar to our system of semi-partial quasi-criminalisation, but again, the buying of sex is illegal. The Policing and Crime Act 2009 also made lap dancing clubs, and we saw some images of lap dancing clubs on those earlier slides of mine. They're now re-regulated as sexual entertainment venues, and they have to have a sexual entertainment venue licence. That is something my students have been critiquing recently, because when you actually look at the regulation, it does a lot more for club owners, the business owners, than it does for the dancers that work within those clubs. So who's that regulation actually for? This, the Policing and Crime Act 2009 as well, gave the power to local councils to introduce nil cap bans. So individual councils could say, we don't want any of these venues in our city or in our town, even if they've operated without problem for decades, they can say, no, we don't want them anymore. And we're seeing a real push at the moment for this to happen. We've seen it in Bristol, although that got overturned. We've seen it in Scotland as well, in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and we're seeing it at the moment in Blackpool. And often it's presented to us as a really common sense understanding that lap dancing clubs are a form of gender inequality, and they promote gendered violence, and they cause gendered violence and sexual violence to women in the surrounding areas, and therefore we should ban them, and then everything in our towns and cities will be much better for women. All it means, if you close down these regulated, currently legal venues, it just means that the people that work within them are going to go and work somewhere else that isn't regulated, or a different part of the sex industry. So instead of stripping, instead of dancing, they might end up partaking in full contact sex work, prostitution, which is obviously a lot more risky on a number of levels. So again, it's about that displacement and dispersal of harm. I put this slide in because I wanted to look a little bit medical for a minute. Bearing in mind I haven't got a science GCSE. And also it helped because when Thor showed me those slides just then of Dr. Ross's venereal clinic, and the Maryland Centre as well, thinking of harm reduction and thinking of disease. Not to blame all the medics, obviously you all do great things, but the socio-historical medical context has had a massively lasting implication for sex workers. And note that someone on that word cloud said disease. Sex workers are constructed as being dangerous, diseased, deviant, something that we should be protected from. And that then means that all kinds of punitive laws and policies are enacted against that group. When you construct someone as diseased That is a really powerful way of getting people to see whatever you're enacting against them as legitimate, because it's going to protect us from this dangerous, dirty, diseased other. So obviously, you'll all know this, the Contagious Diseases Acts of 1864, 1866 and 1869. Sex workers constructed, particularly in the first one, as being dangerous members of society who should be prevented from spreading disease to others. And the women were seen as the problem there, as being the vectors of disease, not the men who were buying the sex. And that led, so this is where medicine and criminology and law collide here in terms of power and control and the regulation of women, compulsory medical inspections and detention of sex workers with venereal diseases. That's what that first act allowed. And it's a much wider debate about the power of the state to control the morality and behaviour of society. And John Simon, who you'll all be more familiar with than me, the first medical officer of Health for London, believed that, of course, while we needed to control disease, he believed that compulsory sexual examinations of sex workers were immoral and should be stopped. It's all about the morality and shaming of disease, and there's a couple of really good medical projects at the moment all about stigma and shaming and how they're always counterproductive. You're never going to shame someone into not spreading disease. We saw that during COVID, of course, as well. It's transferable elsewhere to debates on HIV and so on as well. You're not going to shaming someone is not going to be useful. It's going to actually be harmful. And this disgust and criminality, the way it's conflated together, we can see it all the time. Sex work is conflated with criminality, and by extension, sex workers are conflated as being criminal, horrible threats to the rest of us. And they're always pitted in opposition to the community. And it was interesting speaking to some of you outside just then, because we were speaking about sex work, and the gentleman at the back, I think he was up there a minute ago, I forget his name. Yes, he was saying he'd lived in London for many years, talking about Soho and how the sex industry is obviously very prominent in Soho, and he lived and worked by premises. He didn't care, that was up to them. But often we're told that people don't want to live or work by sex workers or by venues. When you actually engage people in conversation, most people don't care. They're busy with their own lives. They're not really that bothered as long as it doesn't directly affect them. They don't care as long as it's indoors. They can't see it. And often they don't know where these venues are. One of the first things I do when I map out the city on my guided walks, whether it's for here, whether it's for other universities that I do them for as guest lectures, whether it's for art-based organisations. I've done them for FACT, Liverpool, Foundation for Art and Creative Technology. I've done them for block projects in Sheffield, done them for a range of places. When I take people out, I trick them. I get them to walk past a couple first, especially because some people say, oh, they're awful, I don't want to walk past them, you know, they make me feel fearful in the street. So we walk past a few first, and then I say, we've just walked past 3 of these venues, did you not notice? No, where? Because when we walk along, we're talking to someone, or we're looking at our phone these days, or maybe we're looking for where we're going. We're not normally, you know, trying to see where sexual entertainment venues are, or brothels, or where different parts of sex work are taking place. But the media like to position sex workers as a problem.
I was just going to say that now, like, because of stuff like OnlyFans, sex work's probably happening next to all of that, like, hospitals or houses, like, and no sex workers that just work from their home, like, it's everywhere. Like, it's not even just workers in venues now.
Absolutely. And I think it was at the beginning where I said you're a criminologist for asking, how are we even defining sex work? Because if we're defining it as, you know, particular acts, direct contact sex work, prostitution, or stripping, or different exchange-based websites, different adult services, sugar daddy websites and so on, whether it's BDSM services, or whether, the online part of the sex industry is now our biggest part of the sex industry. So it's everywhere, it's all around us. Most of us have smartphones. We don't know what anyone's doing on that smartphone at any time. So it is all around us and everywhere.
But do you consider someone watching pornography as being engaging in sex work?
The person who's selling it or the person who's consuming it? I think it's interesting because if they're consuming something that's been pre-recorded and then they've downloaded it from a tube site or such, or if they're watching something in live time on a pay-per-view website where they might be behind a screen, but they are interacting with that person in live time, then they are interacting with that sex worker. It might be behind a screen, but they're still having that interaction. And that itself brings a lot of problems with parasocial relationships, perceived intimacy, people thinking they are having a genuine intimate moment with someone when they're not. And then when people, one of the things we've looked at on my module is in America, they have these big adult conventions. So people can go and meet all the best known porn stars, essentially, and adult content creators. And because the only time these consumers, these customers, have ever come into contact with that person has been in a very vulnerable moment of perceived intimacy, the lines can be very blurred for that consumer. They think they know that person, they think they know that person very intimately, and they've had an intimate moment with them, whereas that person doesn't know them, they're just a customer, and that can cause a lot of violence, a lot of entitlement, a lot of abuse, that then follows them online with trolling and stuff. So all that kind of research we see on incels, on social media, we see that. And then we see people thinking that the person, the sex worker, has responsibilisation. They are to blame for the violence that happens against them. What do they expect? If they weren't doing that bad thing, then they wouldn't experience that negative behaviour. So they then experience an intensification of the victim blaming that we see across society because people blame them. So that's really interesting. You should definitely be a criminologist, I think. You're asking all the good questions. And on this second one along here, use condoms, heroin spoons and underwear found in Family Park in Liverpool's red light district. It's a way of really making people very emotive, but again, it's making you think that these people are dirty, diseased. They're also taking drugs, often websites as well. So where we've had things like the managed approach in Holbeck in Leeds, which has ended now, which is a grave shame, actually, because the independent review of that showed, whilst not perfect, it was good practice for keeping sex workers safe and for outreach services knowing where they are, for police liaison officers knowing where they are, building a relationship with them. I won't name them, the community group that were very vocal about ending that managed approach where sex workers could sell sex legally on the street, which normally is illegal, and solicitation and curb crawling between certain hours. The community group used images of used condoms, syringes, spoons, tinfoil, litter, and also, bizarrely, but interesting for me, used sanitary ware as well. So I don't know what point they were trying to make with that, but these women are all diseased and oozing out all over the street and disgusting, and we should get rid of them, essentially. Also things like sex for sale at any time, the horrifying reality of prostitution in red light district, sex on the streets, huge increase in street prostitution, but do arrests work, the battle for Shield Road, police taking stronger action to tackle dark world of Liverpool's most notorious street, former sex worker dealing crack and heroin caught by the police. That isn't to say there isn't an issue. I've just put in a grant recently that's looking at street-based sex work in particular, how people can be exploited, and organised crime groups. So clearly when we're thinking about street-based sex work, that is survival-based sex work. We're not saying that's great, everyone go and do it. But what we are saying is, when the general public get most of their information on sex work from BBC Three documentaries or the local press or something they've seen on TikTok or Instagram or whatever, then it can be very easy to legitimise very harmful operations or policy choices or laws against sex workers, because most people will just think, that's gross, that's disgusting, I don't want to see that there, or that's horrible, that's dangerous, let's clamp down on it. There's always this language of like warlike language, like battle, and also like clamping down. Well, if you clamp down on something, you just move it to a different place. That's all you do. You're not solving the issue. Because to solve the issue of street-based sex work would be to address the feminisation of poverty, to address the housing crisis we've got in this country, which is getting worse by the day. I am a sociologist / criminologist, so I might get a little bit political there. Poverty, you know, trauma, drugs, domestic abuse, people fleeing from terrible things that have happened in their life. So you'd have to get a grip on all of that, and that takes a really coordinated approach, a lot of investment. It's not just about clamping down on something. And I must say there are great people in this city doing really important work in that space, but it can be very harmful when some people just get very sensationalised messages and see people as basically the enemy, see sex workers as disposable bodies. That is very harmful and can lead to real violence happening against sex workers, because people think they're legitimate in doing so. They're justified in doing so because they're getting rid of this dirty, horrible thing that shouldn't be on our streets. Now in Merseyside, we are fortunate in many ways. I do think it's a great place because we have the Merseyside model. So violence that happens to sex workers in Merseyside is dealt with under hate crime legislation. It's seen that you've deliberately targeted this person because of their identity, because of their vulnerability, and because you know they're very unlikely to go to the police. So you're not just a violent offender, you're a particularly dangerous, premeditated one as well. And Merseyside Police have done a lot within that space since 2006. So that is very important to note. But one of the unintended consequences, or one of the ways we can see the displacement or dispersal of harm here, is if you clamp down on sex work and you go out and you do loads of arrests, what's going to happen? Is sex work going to end? And you've solved that problem? No? What might happen? Do you think? They just move somewhere else, yeah. Often more hidden, often we don't know where it's taken place, often sex workers themselves won't be with each other because then they're more likely to be visible and to be the subject of potential enforcement operations. So it just makes people who are already on the margins of society, it makes them more vulnerable. And that's a choice to do that. And it's this idea that sex workers are not welcome in a community. And actually, when you look at a lot of the research, communities do often care deeply about sex workers. They might fear for the people involved, who the majority of which are women, but there's also male sex workers, trans and non-binary sex workers as well, but predominantly we're talking about women. And people often, they might not want to see it on their doorstep, they might not want their children seeing it, but they don't want any harm to come to that group of people either. And those kind of complexities aren't played out often in the media, and that is a problem for me as a criminologist. And we also see it, so I have 2 weeks on my module about the Policing and Crime Act 2009, one of my favourite topics, and the re-regulation of strip clubs as sexual entertainment venues, and the tensions that exist surrounding these venues. So I can see you're all reading it, but if I just flick back 1 second, if people don't want direct contact sex work, They might think it's wrong, harmful, violent. They don't want it, whether it's on the street or indoors. But often those same people also don't want sexual entertainment venues, where if you look at the Liverpool licensing policy, I advise you all do, could be some light reading this evening perhaps, no touching takes place. It is not direct contact sex work. Look at that policy and you'll probably think, like, what's the point in a way, because it's actually quite sanitised and there's a lot of distances involved. The dancer cannot touch the customer cannot touch the dancer, and so on. It's a very heavily regulated space, far more so than a normal nightclub, where we're seeing massive rates of sexual harassment, stalking, sexual assault, rape. You know, when I take students out and we do this guided walk and we talk about the rules that are in place, and if they are violated, the club will lose its licence. So it's in its best interest that they do not violate those rules. And when students tell me, or members of the public, depending on the walk, about their experiences in normal, in civilian, in non-sex work related nightclubs, how prevalent that sexual harassment and assault is, and there's lots of projects looking at that at the moment, research project, I'm horrified. But that seems to have been very normalised. And people often say, if they are the victim of that and they retaliate or they complain, they are seen as the problem because it's been so normalised in our society. That is a massive issue with obviously educating young people about consent and so on. But if people don't want this, and they also don't want that, and they also don't want, OnlyFans and different online, what do they want? Because whether they like it or not, people are going to need money, and they're going to need quick money. So the sex industry provides fast cash and fast money. Will you?
I just feel like it comes back to like a wider issue of like how we use sex in our society. Like the fact that people don't want to see it happening in front of them, but like are happy to go home and behind closed doors watch pornography. It's like, I don't want to watch you sell sex, but I'll watch you behind closed doors.
Absolutely, and a lot of the hypocrisy and misogyny involved there as well. So people who are online content creators, for example, might have a big following, then they're getting abused in the street and bottles thrown at them on nights out. But how do the people know what they do unless they've been consuming that material themselves? Because I wouldn't know, because I'm not on that website, so I wouldn't have a clue who's on it or not. But it's that hypocrisy and that anger as well. And you're right, it's a much broader issue about sexuality and sex and people's discomfort. But a lot of these tensions here, they place dancers, they play strippers in opposition to not just the community, but specific communities as well. So some of the opposition recently to clubs being granted a licence or being granted a renewal of their licence if they let it elapse during COVID, the lockdowns for instance, which some clubs did because they didn't know when they were going to be able to reopen. So some people think that sex workers present a risk to the LGBTQIA+ community, for instance, which ignores a lot of things. It ignores the fact that dancers might be part of that queer community. And it ignores the fact that many of these venues have operated within queer nightlife spaces in the city centre for a long time without problem. But it's just a new way of saying that they shouldn't be there. And this one here is an example of Blackpool, where they've closed, well, they will be closing all strip clubs to become more family friendly. Now, I love Blackpool. If anyone's from Blackpool, I'm not slagging it off. I love it. I think it's great. But there's a lot more problems in Blackpool with socio-economic deprivation, so many problems there. Than lap dancing clubs if you did want to improve it and make it more family friendly. But it's an easy win for people. It's a tick box exercise to say we've closed clubs because we want to make it more family friendly. And I'm a bit annoying. I'll tweet councillors who make these claims that closing these venues are going to make the town safer for women and girls, and I'll say that's absolutely brilliant. how does that work? What's that causal relationship there? And they never answer me. Sometimes they block me, but they normally just ignore me because they can't tell me why that is. I'm very interested to know. If they've managed to solve violence against women and girls, that is amazing. Please can they tell me how they've done that in their town or city? And they can't at all. So a lot of this as well comes from something I'd call a zombie report, zombie statistics, something called the Lilith Report, which was produced in 2003 by a charity that is no longer going. And this Lilith Report made the false causal relationship between the existence of lap dancing clubs in Camden and reported rapes in the surrounding areas. You know, I could make all kinds of fake relationships between different things that have happened at the same time. You know, how many knife attacks have there been in Liverpool over the last year, and, you know, how many ice cream vans were out that night or whatever. Both those things might be true, they might be happening at the same time. There's no relationship between them, but people, because if we were to take that as okay, lap dancing clubs cause rape in surrounding areas, we'd also have to look at crime rates for rape that have gone down when clubs have opened. And certainly, again, I don't think, you know, that might look good for lap dancing clubs, but I don't think there's a causal relationship there. But it's often used. It's being used by councillors and MPs at the moment, the Lilith Report, because people like to say evidence says. Does it? Let's have a look at the evidence. I'm a social scientist. I don't care what you're telling me the evidence says. I'd like to look at the evidence, please. But people just like saying it proves, it shows. Does it? No. And very few people look at the original evidence, the original report. They'll rely on the media, that secondary reporting on a source. And also, again, it pits sex workers, or in this case, you know, dancers, in opposition to violent women in the community. When we're looking at violence against women and girls, we have to see dancers as women that violence happens against, and to know that when clubs close, that just leads to dancers, as I said earlier, going into other parts of the industry, which could be full contact sex work, into unregulated venues, you know, hotel rooms, back rooms of pubs or clubs, or financial dependence on abusive partners, and so on. It can very much trap women. As well, when we talk about violence against sex workers, because towards the end of this presentation, I'm going to talk about specific examples that some of my participants have given me, to again sort of hammer home, I'm not glamorising this, you know. When we talk about violence, we often think about individual perpetrators of violence, and not how the law and policy also contribute to violence, if not facilitate the landscape for exploitation and vulnerability to happen. Things like making sex workers work alone if they want to work legally, and so on. And these policy documents that I'm marking, 160 essays at the moment, so they're seared into my brain, they all position sex work as something that should not be tolerated, something that should not be seen as inevitable, and that we shouldn't accept in our communities. And they also conflate sex work with commercial sexual exploitation. Now they, to me, are two different things. Yes, they can exist on a continuum, and people can become exploited over time, but it's deliberately conflated together, just like often all migrant sex work is conflated with trafficking. And by doing that, people very neatly and easily avoid a lot of very difficult things to talk about, you know, very hostile anti-immigration landscape that we've got, and relationships between people, victim, if you like, and trafficker, and how people will often pay traffickers to bring them to this country as a means of getting here, and so on. It's presented as this real binary victim and villain, someone's been snatched and forced, rather than exploitation that can happen over a period of time, where someone has consented to come in here for the purpose of selling sex, but then things start getting very bad. You know, being charged more and more for the accommodation, being made to see more and more clients, the housing situation becoming worse, and then being trapped. Because what are they going to do? Because they don't want the Home Office and the police to be alerted, so they're trapped. So those kind of things, those complexities are often not discussed. Because people don't like complexities, and they don't like thinking about how, you know, we or our government might be complicit in certain things. So my main point here is to think about how the law itself can create some of the violence and exploitation. Vulnerability as a term then that I'd like us to interrogate a little bit. If you're on my module, we'd be looking at vulnerability for 12 weeks, applying it to everything we look at. We haven't got 12 weeks now. It is a very contested term, particularly for criminologists, yet it is one that is often used without any thought process taking place at all, certainly no challenge or interrogation. It is a mechanism of social control, oftentimes, and it is often used as a tool of responsibilisation, that those labelled as vulnerable must then comply with certain orders or certain expectations that are put upon them. And then if they don't meet that, so I'm thinking here of ESOs, engagement support orders, for example, under the Policing and Crime Act 2009, where instead of being arrested or given a fine, sex workers can be given an ESO order, and they're meant to have 3 meetings with a designated person where they're meant to address the root cause of their offending, selling sex. So in 3 meetings, they're meant to resolve the feminisation of poverty and all those really complex things we spoke about earlier to do with socio-economic deprivation. But if they don't comply, then they're seen as, you know, they were given a chance and they chose not to comply. That's on them. They've let themselves down. And one of my participants in my study in prison, my PhD study was in HMP Newhall, which is a women's prison. One of my participants said, and it's a subtitle in one of my journal articles actually, it's a licence to fail. She felt it was a revolving door of working class women into the criminal justice system, and that they were given a situation that they were never going to be able to comply with, that they were never going to be able to stop selling sex after 3 meetings with someone, or they would have already stopped selling sex if it was that easy. It can take years for someone to exit the sex industry, particularly survival-based sex work, who wishes to, and sometimes they can bounce back many times. And often that's because of failures of the welfare state. So certain things will be, the bedroom tax. When that happened, a lot of women went back on the street who hadn't been on the street in years. Charities were reporting an influx of older women who they hadn't seen working for a long time. When there's benefit sanctions, again, how are people going to feed their kids, put money on the meter? If you need money fast and you haven't got a legitimate job and you haven't got family money to fall back on and all these insurance things there, then obviously those women are going to go back out and sell sex. But sex workers are very uniquely positioned in terms of vulnerability, because on the one hand, they're positioned in policy as being uniquely vulnerable, and that's why we shouldn't tolerate sex work, because they're uniquely vulnerable. But yet, they have that vulnerability often simultaneously erased when they come into contact with the criminal justice system. So how can that be? How can they be both of those things? And that's something I see a lot in my work, and in particular, that was really intensified and exacerbated in my prison study. So yeah, it makes no sense to me at all. And lots of other criminologists, not just me. Also, there's a really good legal scholar, Professor Vanessa Munro, who says this. So if you're in my module, you'd be hearing this kind of language all the time. She says about vulnerability and the need to critically interrogate it and not take it for, as granted, as read, she says, it's the interaction of two very different strategies, one in which vulnerability is relied upon by those seeking improved social justice as a mechanism by which to identify, problematise and compel state responses to a universal condition of precarious dependency, and the other in which it is used as a category of neoliberal governance which legitimates state encroachment whilst constructing vulnerable individuals as risk managers who must behave responsibly in the face of disadvantage. So we saw this real push of responsibilisation and this neoliberal way of pushing vulnerable people into the criminal justice system under New Labour, when we saw the introduction of, ASBOs and stuff, antisocial behaviour orders and antisocial behaviour contracts, and it criminalises vulnerable people. It doesn't address the root cause. I'm not saying we should be able to go and all be really antisocial and, terrorise communities, but the fact is there's often a lot of really complex things going on for those people. So quick fixes don't work. And they often trap people into a revolving door of criminalisation as well, which arguably the prison system in this country does. So it's very much seen then as a criminal problem, and we'll see increased enforcement responses, including the use of ASBOs, antisocial behaviour orders, along with the promotion of prevention and support for women to exit prostitution, which sounds all well and good. I'm sure many of you were thinking, well, it's not great people are selling sex on the street, so that's great if they're promoting ways of getting people out. It is great to give people a range of resources and opportunities, but not if they're really conditional, and not if you're going to criminalise someone if they fail to comply with how you want them to do that thing. Because often we talk about coercion and force at the point of entry into the sex industry. But we also need to think about exploitation and coercion at the point of exit as well, because otherwise that person is just going to end up bouncing back and being criminalised and ended up in an even worse situation than what they started with. They're going to end up in this revolving door of criminalisation and internalising a lot of that shame as well, that they've let themselves down, that they've been given these opportunities and they didn't manage to use them. So ESOs, engagement and support orders, were introduced in England and Wales for those convicted or those who would have been convicted of soliciting in a street or public place for the purposes of prostitution. And under the Policing and Crime Act 2009, Section 17, you have to have 3 meetings with a responsible, suitable person. And sex workers, if they have those meetings, are meant to address the causes of their conduct constituting the offence, selling sex, and find ways to cease engaging in such conduct in the future. And I wish I'd been in the room with the people writing this. Like, who would? When I tell my mum, my mum is brilliant. My mum is nearly 82. She left school at 14. When I tell her things like this, she's like, well, that's not going to work, is it? No, it's not. So, common sense, she looks a bit critically and thinks, well, how's that going to work for that person? So,
what is considered a suitable person? Yeah.
Someone that's been appointed by the court, so someone associated with a charity, yeah. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's so subjective in and of itself, isn't it? And this is part of this broader trend globally for forced re-education or rehabilitation, compulsory rehabilitation of sex workers, which has obviously got that socio-historical medical influence as well. So yeah, and other people call this kind of a be helped or else, or a forced welfareism as well. It never helps people, really. But a lot of my work, and hopefully some of what I've done today or will do, is about storytelling. So somebody asked me before, over drinks, before the talk, what method I tended to use, what methodological framework in my research. And I was talking about my prison study, and I said I used thematic analysis, but I used reading aloud of literature and creative writing as one of my methods. I also like photo voice. I use very creative methodologies because I never assume someone can read or write, because that's a very privileged thing to be able to read or write, and I never like to make people often who can't read or write or are very limited ability to read or write often mask it really well. They'll pretend to read and they'll mirror what other people are doing, and then they're losing out on all kinds of information. They wouldn't be able to give consent and so on. So I prefer to use these ways. And also it's all about power. You know, who gets to create knowledge about a group, and why does it have to be written, and why does it have to be written in a peer-reviewed journal article to be legitimate or valid or useful knowledge we can draw from? Given that in many communities nothing is ever written down, it's passed on in oral history tradition, and that's how you get to find things out. Then other people swoop in and write a journal article on it and say, look what we've just found, look what we've just invented. No, you didn't. People have been doing that for a long, long time. You're the first one to put it out there in that way. So I really like giving people the opportunity, giving them the platform to share their stories and frame their experiences in a way that they wish to. And that can be some of the language they use as well. I use the term sex worker because it's an umbrella term for all the activities we've been speaking about. It's kind of more respectful as well, because prostitute is traditionally used as a slur. It's also, you know, a legal term. Sex worker is more, it's something someone does as a job. It's something someone does as an exchange, not the whole entirety of their being. But sex workers I work with might call themselves prostitutes, whores, hoes, whatever it is. They can do that because that's their language to do that with, because they are the in-group there. So I use in my pedagogy as well when I teach, really influenced by the work of Bell Hooks. So I have been working to change the way I speak and write, to incorporate in the manner of telling a sense of place, of not just who I am in the present, but where I am coming from, the multiple places within me. I refer to that personal struggle to name the location from which I come to voice that space of theorising. It's really important in my research as well to state my positionality. Sometimes, not always, I'm sure not today, but sometimes people from other disciplines struggle with that because they say, shouldn't research be objective? And as a social scientist, I would really critique what objectivity is. But within this qualitative research, it's all about people being given the space to tell their stories and expand on them. Obviously, you can use mixed methods. We need quantitative data as well. But it's really important because it gives power to people who are so often the subject for other people's research or agendas to be able to speak for themselves. And also this. So my reason, my rationale for research can also be contained in this way. Our struggles can have meanings, and our privileges, however precarious under patriarchy, can be justified only if they help to change the lives of women whose gifts and whose very being continue to be thwarted and silenced. So it's important to be able to help other people make change, to fight for social justice and positive change alongside the group. You're not just going in, doing research on a group and saying what's best for them. You're working with people, you're sharing your platform, you're often handing your platform over. And one of the good things about being a dyslexic is I'm a good storyteller, so that works well for me. But violence against sex workers is real. And it is important that, I'm not seen to be glamorising it and just talking about certain parts of the industry. And just to trigger warning, because this is quite violent, these are some of my participants what they've said in one of my larger studies. So all their pseudonyms they've chosen themselves. So one of my participants, Kate, said, "This one guy picked me up, he gave me money, he took me to a hotel, and he told me one of his fantasies was to kill a prostitute." So on December the 17th every year, we have International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers, and we remember all the sex workers globally who've been killed, and they've been murdered because they're a sex worker, because of the hatred towards them, and because so often they've been constructed as disposable, not quite the same as other people, not quite the same as other women. And one of my other participants, Lily, says, "My first one," so she's experienced a lot of violence, "I was in an alley with this Polish guy, and I'll never forget his eyes. He picked me upside down and he was trying to strangle me, and I was screaming that loud, the neighbour put his lights out." So the neighbour didn't ring the police or try and help her. He just thought, it's one of them prostitutes, I'm not going to get involved with that. "I had to say I had kids. I was just pleading with him because you just feel like you're not going to." And we were talking within there.
I thought that he put his lights out as he came to her aid. He put his lights out. But it doesn't mean
He put his lights out and he just didn't get on with it. He didn't want to get involved, which again goes back to the fact that sex workers are seen as not being part of the community, someone that shouldn't be there, something that should be eradicated. So let's just not look at what's happening out there, because you would like to think if a woman was being attacked in the street, people would want to help. That's what happened there. And as well, sex workers feeling like they're not good enough to be helped, to know that someone saw that but didn't bother doing anything about it, like how that's going to make someone feel horrendous. And we were talking as well, kind of what we can see here in the next slide, we were talking about almost violences as well. So a term I coined is almost violence, where even if the violence hasn't happened directly to you, you're aware of it. It very much is a looming threat that's always there, and you always know that next time it might be you. So Tilly said, and this is from one of my journal articles that's about They Only Care When There's a Murder On, it's called. And she says, "Well, I can remember exactly when it happened, a murder of a sex worker. What police did, they came down on the beat and they said, listen, we'll get you off the street tonight. And they was giving them food parcels and that, because they know they've not got anything. It's not just for drugs, do you know what I mean? So they were trying to help them the best way they could by giving them food parcels for the kids. But it should be like that all the time, not just when there's a murder going on. Often when the media spotlight is on a certain place geographically, then you seem to see all this great visible activity happening. But as Tilly says, it should be like that all the time, because sex workers are predominantly women. They should be seen as part of that violence against women and girls agenda and as a full citizens like anybody else. So, thank you. And I think you've put an extra slide on the end. If you want to get in touch with me, you can tweet me, which I'd very much like, email me, my staff profile, my blog, etc.
Just want to say that was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
That was so fascinating.
Thank you so much.
So much of what you were saying was just like totally mind-blowing. You were saying that like the way that you were speaking about vulnerability was the way that we could never even consider that, like I just never thought of it like that. So
Good.
I also just want to say that something I think about quite often is the division between sex workers who are able to make a choice about doing sex work and who can make quite substantial amounts of money from it and are in a really protected, safe place, like, you know, say on OnlyFans behind a screen, that there's not direct contact with them and a consumer, like on a physical level. And for those sex workers who sex work isn't a choice, you know, like you talk about women who are having to support their families and where you know, there's no kind of safety, they might not even be making any money. I just kind of wondered what your thoughts were about
So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that. A lot of that street-based sex work that I was talking about there is survival sex work. It's certainly not glamorous. People aren't making a lot of money. They might have a more limited range of choices to begin with. But I think it's important that support given, and there's lots of brilliant charities and organisations, it's non-judgmental support to meet people where they're at now, whether they want to exit or not, or whether they say they want to exit but in the future, rather than it being kind of forced welfareism and having you know, a lot of caveats attached that then if they can't meet, they then feel that they failed. So I think absolutely it's really important that we acknowledge that and that we don't glamorise it or promote it as well. Because when we're talking about it, we're also talking about those women, and even though street-based sex work is the smallest part of our industry, it's still there, and those women are humans that need our support.
You've achieved spontaneous applause and spoiled my fun bit. So I get you to come down to the front now. So ladies and gentlemen, you've already given a round of applause. So this is a rather unusual. This lecture series is I get to choose who comes to speak. It's a real pleasure for me. And the other pleasure I get is to give a small medal to all speakers. And this is your President's Medal for speaking to the Liverpool Medical Institution. So there you are. It's a rather old-fashioned tradition.
Never had a medal before.
Well, you've got a medal now. Thank you so much. You can't listen for an hour and a quarter. I normally I'd ask for more questions, but in fact the questions have been coming thick and fast all evening. But there are questions. Go on.
I'm just going to say, I came on you guys' walk. I think it was one organised by Fabs. It was absolutely brilliant. The inside of the club, just the insight you get, you don't know as a member of the public. So if you ever do one again, I recommend you can go on.
You're the one of the photos on my blog.
Well, perhaps we should advertise the next one through the LMI. You can get a good
we'll
turnout.
all go down there.
Yeah. I'm looking around for any more questions, but I'm not. Please.
I was just wondering if these, what are the biggest charities that are, like, if you wanted to get involved, I guess, especially from a healthcare perspective. Because I know in Kenya, like, on Shield Road, there used to be a van that would go on, like, I don't know whether that's still running or...
So one of the main ones is the Red Umbrella Project, which originally was set up by Merseyside Police and the Police Crime Commissioner. Also there's like a lot of outreach to local churches and stuff, but the main one is the Red Umbrella Project. But if you want any follow-ups, you want any information on signposting, email me or tweet me and send you links. Yes, there's MASH, Manchester Action on Street Health, which are a brilliant organisation, do a lot with harm reduction.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I couldn't have done that.
Don't go away just yet. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the blatant advert for those of you that are new to the LMI, in any way associated with medicine or allied health professionals, psychology, criminology, anything. Please take a little scan of this. We have got membership, so if you're a medic or a surgeon or a dentist, we charge you a lot. If you're an allied health professional, we charge you hardly anything at all. If you're a medical student, we charge you nothing at all. So have you all signed up? You know, we will. Right. And next we have got Professor Richard Shaw, who's going to talk to us about the early diagnosis of oral cancer. I think actually this is the first lecture in the series that is going to be the traditional medical chalk and talk. So far we've been doing much more interesting things such as yours, Gemma. So for that I do apologise, but this is one that's it's a joint meeting. It's a joint meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on a very cold night. Could we have one last vote of thanks to Gemma, Dr. Ahearne. And now to Hope Street. Thank you very much.
They didn't do that.